Well, thank you for joining us today. This is our introductory We Share a Book and a Bite. We stands for Patty Wagner and Cheryl Erickson. We both enjoy reading and talking about books that we read. And so we decided that we would put together a little video and start a, I guess we're starting a series. And this is our introduction as to kind of what kinds of things we like to read and a little bit about who we are.
So I'll go ahead and get started with that. One thing, though, I will say is when we were talking about this concept, Cheryl is so good with our during our book discussions, bringing a bite with her to eat and sharing a bite that has to do with the book. So one thing that we're going to be incorporating every single time is some sort of food element into when we talk. So that's going to be sort of a fun part too, and we'll be sharing that in our things too. But for me, we thought that we would just talk about some books that have meant something to us, what kind of books we like. So as you're watching our reviews, you know a little bit about us. My name is Patty Wagner. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at Winfield Public Library. And during my stay at Winfield, I met Cheryl, and we really enjoyed talking books. So we thought this might be sort of fun. So for me, some of the books that have spoken to me or types of books that I like, I really like, I'm not a big self-discovery book type of person. I appreciate that people are sharing themselves with us, but at the same time, I think if a book is going to be that way, it needs to be shorter rather than longer. I think at a certain point I lose, I'm like, yeah, I got it. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, I got it. I think we all go through self-discovery. So while it's interesting learning about different people, I think that can be done in about 200 pages. And then I'm on to the next thing. For example, even for like Eat, Pray, Love, I got through Eat and Pray and I just ignored that's like, I really enjoy mysteries. I enjoy action books, thrillers, things along those lines, stories that really keep me going. I love a book when I either am totally into the plot or really care about a character. One of those two things, I think that's for most people have to keep you going. So for me, a few books that have spoken to me was the first one was Water for Elephants, really said something to me. Not even, I think the book itself was so vivid. I think I could imagine, I'm such a visual learner, I could imagine the scenes and I could imagine the pain that was going through the book. But to me, it all came together at the very end. I think the end of the book, it means so much in a book. You could have this great book, and if the end falls apart, then the whole book is ruined. But for me, Water for Elephants had the best ending. I just thought it sort of was perfect. I didn't think that there was any way they could end this book well, and yet I think the author managed to do it. So I hold that book close. I also, just one thing I should say is I very rarely reread a book because I'm afraid if I love it enough to reread it, I will not like it the second time. So I usually read a book once. I know that's sort of weird. Read a book once, every once in a while I'll revisit a book. But that's sort of what I think. Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime is another one of my favorites. And that book came to me at a certain time in my life when I really needed it. Said from the point of view of an autistic person with autism, I should say. It really spoke to me at that time. I was sort of learning how to interact with my nephew who has autism. And for that reason, it really allowed me to understand that no matter, you're not going to be perfect all the time. It's better to engage and try, and you will find your sort of way of being a good aunt for me with my nephew. And it really, I think, gave me the gift of saying, it's okay, you're not going to be perfect, so go ahead. I sort of, things have a tendency to hold me back sometimes when if I can't do it well, I don't want to do it. And until you actually try things, you don't know how to do it well. And I think that it allowed me to sort of have that freedom to make mistakes. So I appreciate that very much, because my nephew is absolutely fantastic. He's 23 now and he's absolutely fantastic. And then another book that I really enjoyed for a different reason was Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. Alice Hoffman is one of my favorite authors. I love the sort of magical things that she paints in her books. It's a thin book, which I appreciate too. Sharon and I have talked. I'm a big fan of books that around 350 or less pages, even though I have liked some thick ones. The Other Boleyn Girl is a great one. Uh, but Practical Magic, I really enjoyed for a totally different reason. I did not realize it was an Alice Hoffman book. I loved the movie, thought it was fantastic. And then when I was reading one Alice Hoffman book, I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize Practical Magic was. Picked it up, completely different from the movie. And I thought that was fantastic that I got to love this book and love this movie, and they were completely different things, which I think was sort of fun. So, while I love mysteries, there are certain books that are not of that genre that really have spoken to me and I hold very close and dear to my heart. So those are a few of my favorites. So I'll turn it over to Cheryl now.
All right. Well, I grew up as a reader, and reading, probably one of those kids that always had a book in my hand. It was, I would say, not just something that I enjoyed, but probably something that I needed. I could probably say it kind of saved my um, sanity, made my life less stressful. And then I grew up to be an elementary school teacher, so I continued to read, and still, now that I'm teaching people to be teachers at Southwestern, I still read a lot of books for children and young adults. Every year I pick several and read those. So one book that I would say that I really like, and not just this one, Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss, but a lot of Dr. Seuss books. Certainly shared those with students, and my own son, as you know, as he was growing up, and as I had elementary students. Then A Wrinkle in Time is probably one of my favorite, young adult books. Actually, the whole series. I just I've read quite a few other books too by Madeline L'Engle, and I had the opportunity to meet her once in Wichita and have her sign my book. And she said, "Cheryl, tess her well. If you haven't read A Wrinkle in Time, you may not know what that means, so go read it." And the book there is a movie too, recently came out with Oprah Winfrey, Reese Witherspoon, and Amy Cowling. Yeah, Amy, I think is her first name. Um, and it's good. I enjoyed it. It was fun, but the book is even better. So that. But so then, you become an adult and you think you need to read more adult books. And I don't think I have a specific genre. I mean, certainly I've read kind of books of a type, and a lot of times I'll find a book that I like, an author,
Mhm.
and many authors write a lot of books kind of the same type. So I've done that sort of thing, and probably the adult book author that I would say right now, and has for a number of years been a big influence on my reading, is Stephen King. And I wasn't surprised, because I wouldn't have thought I would like his books. I'm not into horror movies, but the books are much more than just that. And they're not all really horror. I mean, a lot of them, I mean, they always have some kind of, like you talked about, that you like books that have kind of a supernatural element. And so some of his are not what I would certainly strictly call horror, but there is some kind of supernatural kind of event. My favorite is his biggest, fattest single book, is called The Stand, and that is my all-time favorite of his, although I am working my way through the Dark Tower series, of which there are 6 books, or I think one of them is called a half book. So I think there's actually 6. I think there's actually 7 books, but one of them is a half book. And I'm ready for the very last one. But it's stuck in Iowa with my son because of all this craziness. Hopefully I will get it and be able to read that this summer. Um, and then my all-time number one, since about probably 2012 or so, I read this book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Different than anything I've ever read before. I it's a based on a true story of this woman, Henrietta Lacks, and it's got a lot of science and some history, but it's really about her and then her family and what has happened to her and kind of their um, like I said, it's got a lot of science in it. It's written as a true story, but it's written as a novel, so it tells this story, and it is absolutely to me a must read. Everyone should read this book and know this story and what kind of what was done to her and how and why. And I think again, right now in the kind of times that we're living in, um, the science is so important, but it's also social emotional. It's about people. It's very much about the development, and science can certainly give us all kinds of information, but it's what we people do with it, what humans do with it, then that really puts that whole life perspective. So um, again, it wasn't a typical type of book that I would have read, and it for 8 years now has been my number one book.
Was that book recommended to you, Cheryl, by someone, or was it just, how did you find it?
That was it. Shortly after I became to work here at Southwestern College as a professor, a little couple perks that you get some every now and then is publishers books. They will send you and say, "Hey, would this be a book you might use in a course?" So I have two different companies that send me things every now and then, and this came out in that list. So I got this one. I have multiple copies because I share them with people. But the first one I got free from them. And another book that I got at that same time was On the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, which is really good also, and about the Japanese internment camp situation in the United States, which I did not know about as a going through all of my years of college, or school and even undergraduate college. I did not learn about that we did that until I was an adult. I was born after World War II, but still, you would have thought that it would have been in the history. And so both of those, I can't remember, but that was kind of the message of that particular list was, there's some things in our history that we're not being quite straightforward about. I was teaching a social science class, a social studies class for teachers at that time, and I think that might have been why I got that particular book list. So
Well, and a lot of people don't know this about me. You probably do, because I think I've said this before, but I was a museum curator for 25 years. And so my background is as a historian and research, exhibit, and turning history into programming for the public. So I love books like that book that sort of turn something on. And a lot of times, like Devil in the White City is a great example of book that I think grabs everyone in that way, where I started reading it because of the serial killer aspect, and then really got into the White City part of it. So by the end, I was almost skipping the chapters about the serial killer because I'd sort of lost interest and was reading about the World's Fair and doing a ton of research online. And at that time, I was living in Racine, Wisconsin, and working at the museum there. And some of the they're boats, but they call them something else, and I apologize, I've lost the word for it. But some of the boats that were made in Racine were sent down to that World's Fair, and so that sort of connection. And so I completely agree. Sometimes you fall down these rabbit holes. I know when I would research topics, I'd fall down these rabbit holes. I was researching baseball in North Carolina, and suddenly I'm into mill culture, the mill baseball teams, and these things grab you, and you just sort of you put the book aside and keep reading it, but do all this work on the other outside of it to sort of discover these different stories that you didn't know anything about. So I love that. That's really cool. So okay, and then
expands our mind.
It does. It introduces us to different things. So real fast, Cheryl, how many books do you normally have going at one time? That's a tough question, I think, for you. For me, it's probably an easier question. So for you, how many books do you have
Well,
rolling?
I have to give a little background history on that. I said, as a child, I had a book in my hand all the time, but it was one book at a time. I read one book at a time. And I would say that certainly, when I was going to college and stuff like that, I had to be reading textbooks, but I was still reading one book at a time. My son, though, who is a reader too. He's grown up now, but as a youngster, he would have multiple books going on. And I was kind of like, okay, if this 8-year-old, 9-year-old can do it, why can't I? So now I probably have almost always at least two books. Something, that's a novel that I'm reading just because I want to read it, and then maybe something that I do read some. I read more like self-help or
Hmm.
books. Again, books that now that I'm teaching college, most of my books that I use in my classes, I use very few actual textbook. But there's quite a few books that I can bring in because I'm teaching specific. So I may be reading something like that. So there's pretty much always at least two that are being read simultaneously. And now that I can read on my phone, there may be a third one there, and then there's one in the car that I'm listening to on tape. So I suppose probably around 4 books at a time.
Yeah, I figured you were about, I actually had you, and if you consider the Stephen King series, I had you about 5 in my head.
Okay, yes, well, because that is ongoing, and I have to wait until my son gets finished with each one because he has to read them first. I had to wait till he read Harry Potter before I could read them. So,
Yeah, and I'm more of a 2 to 3 books. I would prefer to read one at a time. I'm still a one person because, and here's my reasoning. If it's one I'm really into, that I want to be into that. It sort of takes over. And if it's two, then it's usually one I'm really into and one that I'm not as much into, but I'm sort of treating myself to that first one I'm into by reading chapters in that second one. So it's sort of, it's the payoff. It's, you get a bite of something good if you eat 3 bites of peas, basically,
yeah,
which I
yeah.
like anyway. That type of treat. So I usually try to keep it to no more than 2 books, but a lot of times I've got 3 going, especially with my job now. It's sort of the way it is. When I would do research, um, uh, of course, that's a totally different thing. And into multiple books and being very clear to mark them. So I like the freedom of not having, you know, 8 books open at the same time, all about the same thing, trying to keep them straight. So that is helpful to me. So, but yeah, and one thing I've really enjoyed though too is with this position at the library, opening myself up to different things and discovering that I really like them. I enjoy that a lot. So a lot of times, so I'll have something that I have to read for work, which is, and then my sort of pleasure reading book too. So, and sometimes that goes into what you were talking about, Cheryl, which isn't necessarily self-help, but maybe, when I was younger, a lot of parenting books. I read a ton of parenting books. Um, and just to give, sometimes you walk away with one idea and that's all I needed was just that one idea. So yeah, yeah. But different stages, different things you're looking for, different jobs, different occupations.
Yeah, and certainly being involved with the library book discussions and reading challenges and things like that, I try some different things that I might not have tried otherwise, which I'm grateful for. That's part of my reason for participating in those. And occasionally I find I really don't like it, and sometimes I don't finish a book because
Mhm.
I hardly ever read a book over again. Not because I think I might not like it if I really liked it the first time, but because there's so many more
There's
out
so
there.
many.
I don't have time to read books over.
So, oh shoot, I just had a question when you were talking, and now I can't remember what it was. But shoot. Anyway, um, yeah. So and I agree. There's so many great stories, but for me, I really am scared that I'm gonna dislike the book, and I don't want to, like, I want to hold it. So for, if you were to ask me about Water for Elephants, I could tell you generally what it's about, but I can't tell you the details. My mind doesn't hold on to those details, which is great as a historian, by the way, too. Like, I had to write everything down. But so I sort of relate to books emotionally. How did I feel during that story? How did I feel at the end? And that's how I relate to that book. So I try to sort of, I think I could probably read a book again and have it, a totally different emotional reaction to it based on the time in my life that I'm going through. So yeah, interesting. So anyway, that's us. Those are the people that are going to be reviewing books. And we have our first review out on Little Comfort, which is Edwin Hill's book. So that's up on YouTube. You can sort of watch that review if you want, please. And our next book, Cheryl, is Children of the Stars, correct?
Yes.
So we're going to be reading that coming up, and we'll be reviewing it. So if you want to go ahead, and if you want to watch our review after we've after you've read it, then feel free to do so. We'd love to sort of have that input on you. But thank you very, very much. And as you read a book, think of what bite you would have. And then Cheryl?
Yes. P.S. Patty, Cheryl, ask, what are you reading?
Thank you.
Thank you.